My wife died in a highway crash on Interstate 76 outside Pennsylvania, or at least that is what they told me, and I remember the exact moment those words stopped sounding like language and started sounding like something hollow inside my chest. No survivors, Mr. Walker, the officer said, not looking at me long enough to feel human, and my sister-in-law whispered under her breath, "At least it's finally over. She was always gone anyway." While my own brother added, "Don't act shocked, Ethan. You never really knew her life outside your little routine." I stood there in the corridor of the county medical office, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like they were tired of witnessing grief, and someone from Claire's extended family muttered, "Maybe now we can finally close her affairs without complications," as if my wife's death was paperwork, not a collapse of everything I thought I understood. Then a man in a dark suit stepped forward and said, "I am the estate executor for Dr. Claire Walker," and when I asked him why I had never seen him before, he replied, "Because your wife structured her life to ensure you would not." I felt the room tilt slightly, not from emotion but from disbelief, and someone actually laughed, a short dismissive sound, saying, "Ethan, you always thought she was simple, didn't you?" And I realized in that moment they were not grieving with me, they were judging me, and somehow I was the last person in the room to understand that I had become an outsider in my own marriage. And then the executor placed a sealed envelope in my hand and said, "There is a property you are entitled to see immediately." And when I asked where, he said, "New York City." And when I asked what property, he said, "A penthouse in Manhattan your wife has owned for over 7 years." And the room went silent in a way that felt heavier than grief itself. I remember someone behind me saying, "That is impossible," and another voice replying, "Or he just didn't know her at all." If this story reaches you in any way, take a second, like and subscribe. And only if this story speaks to your heart, leave a comment telling me where you are watching from and what time it is in your city right now, because I want to know how far this truth travels. My name is Ethan Walker. I am 58 years old, and I used to think I understood my marriage until the night my wife was declared dead and I was handed a key to a life she never allowed me to see. And what I am about to tell you is not just about loss. It is about how a man can live decades next to someone and still discover he was never standing inside the real version of their life at all. And maybe the lesson in this is not about her, but about what we refuse to see when love becomes routine. And if you stay with me until the end of this story, you will understand exactly what I mean. And now let me take you back to where everything truly began. It started with silence, the kind that does not feel empty at first, only normal, the kind you only recognize later as distance wearing the mask of peace. Claire and I had been married 25 years, long enough that people stopped asking if we were happy and started assuming we were stable, which in a way is its own kind of invisibility. And I worked in logistics consulting tied to military contracts around Arlington, Virginia, while she was a biomedical researcher who traveled often between Boston and Washington, and I used to joke that we were both professionals in managing absence, but she never laughed at that the way I expected her to. "You are quiet tonight." I remember saying one evening in our kitchen, the sound of the refrigerator humming between us like a third presence, and she replied without looking up, "I am always quiet, Ethan. You are just now noticing it." And I did not know what to say to that, because it sounded less like a complaint and more like a fact I had failed to learn sooner. After her death, I replayed moments like that constantly, trying to find signs I had ignored. But back then I only told myself we were tired, not drifting, and I believed that because belief is easier than uncertainty. The crash report came 3 days after the call, a single vehicle incident on a stretch of highway that investigators said was under review, which is a phrase I learned usually means they are not telling you everything yet. And the officer who briefed me avoided eye contact when he said, "There is partial identification, but confirmation is pending." And I remember asking him, "Pending what exactly?" And he replied, "DNA verification and mechanical analysis." And I noticed how carefully he chose words, like every sentence had been weighed against something he was not allowed to say. That night I sat alone in our house in Arlington, the kind of suburban quiet where you can hear your own thoughts too clearly, and I kept thinking about Claire's last phone call. Just seconds of static-filled connection, her voice saying, "I am heading back now," and then nothing. And I did not know then that nothing can become the loudest sound in a man's life. The knock on the door came the next afternoon, not from police this time, but from a man who introduced himself as Martin Hale, a state attorney, New York jurisdiction, And when he said my wife's name, he said it like it belonged to a file, not a person, and he asked me to sit down before he continued, which is never a good sign. Dr. Claire Walker placed specific instructions in an irrevocable trust, he said, sliding documents across my kitchen table. And I remember laughing once, not because it was funny, but because it felt unreal. And I said, my wife does not have a penthouse in Manhattan. And he looked at me calmly and replied, she does, and she made sure you would only learn about it after her death. And that was the first moment I felt something shift, not grief, not shock, but a quiet sense that I had been living beside a locked door for years without ever realizing there was a key on the table the entire time. The next morning I went to New York because there are decisions you do not make twice. And when I arrived at the Upper West Side address, the building looked too ordinary for what it contained. Stone facade, glass entry, doorman who avoided questions, and the elevator ride to the top floor felt longer than it should have, as if the building itself was aware I was about to learn something it had been protecting. The attorney handed me a single key and said, she requested you come alone, and I remember asking him, is anyone inside? And he replied, that is what you are here to find out. And when the door finally opened, the air inside felt still, almost waiting, lights already on as if someone had just stepped out. And then I saw movement in the far corner of the room, slow, deliberate, and a voice I did not recognize said my wife's name like she was still alive. And I froze because in that moment I understood the most terrifying possibility was not that Claire had died in that crash, but that I had only been told the version of her life I was allowed to see. And the person standing in that penthouse looked at me and said, you are later than we expected, Mr. Walker. And that was when I realized the truth about my wife's death had only just begun to reveal itself. The penthouse was silent in a way that felt intentional, not empty, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath while I stood just inside the doorway and tried to make sense of the man who had spoken my wife's name like she might still walk in at any moment. And I remember my hand tightening around the edge of the doorframe because something in me refused to accept that I was now part of a conversation I had never been invited into. You are later than we expected, Mr. Walker. The woman in the corner said again, calm, steady, almost rehearsed. And I forced myself to take one step forward, then another, the carpet thick under my shoes like I was walking into someone else's life instead of my own. Who are you? I asked, and my voice did not sound like fear. It sounded like distance, like my mind was trying to protect itself from breaking too quickly. She studied me for a moment, then gestured slightly toward the windows overlooking Manhattan, where the evening light was sliding across glass towers like water, and she said, that depends on what your wife told you about me. And when I told her she told me nothing, I saw something shift in her expression, not surprise, but confirmation. My throat felt dry as I stepped further inside, noticing details I did not want to notice. A coffee cup still warm on the table, a coat folded over the back of a chair, a laptop closed but not shut down, as if someone had only just stepped away for a moment rather than being gone from the world entirely. This apartment belongs to Dr. Claire Walker, I said finally, more to myself than to them. And the attorney who had followed me inside closed the door gently behind us and replied, legally, yes, but operationally, that is not the complete truth. I turned toward him immediately, because that word, operationally, did not belong in any sentence about my wife, and I said, explain that to me in a way that makes sense. And he nodded slowly, like he had been waiting for that exact request. The woman finally walked closer, and I noticed she moved with the kind of controlled precision people develop when they are used to being careful about every detail of their presence, and she said, your wife did not live a single life, Mr. Walker. She maintained parallel ones. And I almost laughed because it sounded impossible, something out of a report or a story someone tells to justify confusion, but nothing about her tone suggested fiction. I walked past her into the center of the room, looking at photographs on a side table that I did not recognize. Claire standing beside people I had never seen, wearing expressions I had never witnessed, smiling in ways that felt unfamiliar, and I heard myself say, we were married for 25 years. And my voice cracked slightly on the word 25 because suddenly it sounded less like time shared and more like time divided. Yes, the attorney replied. And during that time, she also maintained a federally protected research contract identity that required strict separation from personal disclosure. And I turned sharply toward him. Federally protected? I repeated, because that was the first moment the story stopped feeling like betrayal and started feeling like something larger, something structured, something I could not simply understand through emotion alone. The woman moved to the window and looked out over the city before speaking again, and she said, "She was not hiding from you in the way you think. She was compartmentalizing risk." And I asked, "Risk from what?" And she paused long enough that I could hear the faint hum of the building ventilation, steady and indifferent. "From people who would have preferred she did not complete her work," she said finally, and I felt a cold weight settle in my chest because she said it so calmly, like it was not speculation, but classification. I sat down without realizing I was doing it, my legs suddenly less certain than my thoughts, and I asked, "What work?" And the attorney exchanged a look with her before answering. "Biomedical research tied to proprietary neural mapping systems funded through private defense contractors," and I shook my head once, slowly, because I was trying to fit those words into the woman I thought I had known. The woman who packed lunches sometimes, who stood at the sink in the morning without speaking, who once told me she was tired, and I believe that was the whole story. "She never told me anything like that," I said, and the woman replied quietly, "She was not permitted to." I stood up again because sitting made it harder to breathe, and I walked toward the center table where a folder had been left open, papers arranged with careful symmetry, and on the top page I saw my wife's signature repeated across documents that looked like legal instruments I had never seen before, and beneath them a name I did not recognize listed as co-executor of her estate. "Who is this person?" I asked, pointing at the name, and the attorney said, "Someone she trusted with continuity in the event of her disappearance." And I stopped breathing for a moment at that word, disappearance, because it did not belong anywhere near death certificates and accident reports. The woman finally looked directly at me, and her voice softened slightly as she said, "We need you to understand something, Mr. Walker. The crash you were told about may not represent the full sequence of events." And I felt my pulse slow in a way that was not calm but defensive, like my body was preparing for impact I could not yet see. I looked around the penthouse again, at the quiet, at the light, at the evidence of a life continuing beyond explanation, and I said, "So what am I supposed to believe now?" And for the first time, the attorney did not answer immediately, which told me more than any words could have. Then the woman stepped closer to me, lowering her voice as if the walls themselves might be listening, and she said, "You are supposed to remember something your wife made sure you would forget." And before I could ask her what she meant, her phone vibrated once on the table, and when she looked at it, her entire expression changed, and she said only 4 words that made the room feel suddenly smaller. "They found the data," and in that instant I understood that whatever I had walked into was not an explanation of my wife's death, but the beginning of something that had already been moving long before I arrived. The silence in the penthouse had changed. It was no longer the silence of a closed room, but the silence of something actively waiting, as if every object inside it had already heard the conversation we were about to have and was deciding how much it should reveal. The woman who had spoken earlier stood near the window again, her phone still in her hand, and the attorney had not moved since he read those 4 words out loud. I finally broke the silence myself and said, "You said they found the data. What data?" My voice felt distant, like it belonged to someone else listening from far away. The attorney hesitated, then replied, "That depends on how much of your wife's professional life you were ever exposed to," and I felt something tighten inside me at the word exposed, because it suggested I had been kept outside a boundary I never even knew existed. I turned toward him and said, "I was her husband. 25 years. There was no exposed and hidden. There was just life." And for a brief moment I thought I saw sympathy in his face before it disappeared again into something more careful. The woman finally stepped away from the window and said quietly, "That is not how compartmentalized research partnerships work, Mr. Walker." And I asked her, "And how exactly do they work?" She took a slow breath, then said, "They work by ensuring that personal relationships cannot interfere with classified continuity protocols." And I repeated the word classified because it did not belong in my marriage, or at least I had believed it did not. The attorney opened a second folder, this one thinner, and slid it across the table toward me, and I noticed my name printed on the cover for the first time, not Claire's. "You are listed here as a restricted secondary contact," he said, and I frowned, because being secondary contact in a marriage sounded like a contradiction that should not exist in any legal system I understood. I opened the folder and saw documents with dates I did not recognize, signatures I did not remember witnessing, and references to a biomedical initiative tied to several private defense contractors based in Boston and Northern Virginia, and I felt my mind resisting comprehension, not because it was impossible, but because it was too structured to dismiss as fiction. She was monitoring neurological response patterns in classified trauma recovery subjects. The attorney continued, and I looked up sharply and said, "Trauma recovery subjects?" Claire was a physician, not an intelligence officer, and he replied, "In this case, the distinction was intentionally removed." The woman stepped closer again and said, "Your wife's research required anonymity layers. Financial, geographic, and personal." And I shook my head slowly because the words were building a version of Claire that did not fit into any memory I had. "We lived in Arlington," I said, almost to myself. "We had dinners, we had routines, she packed hospital bags. She complained about traffic on Interstate 95, and I stopped because I realized how small all of that sounded compared to what they were describing." The attorney nodded slightly and said, "And she maintained that life precisely so no one would look too closely at the other one." That sentence landed differently than the rest. Not as accusation, not as explanation, but as structure. I sat down again, this time slower, because something in my body was beginning to accept that I was not going to stand my way out of this conversation. "Why me?" I asked finally, and the question surprised even me because it was not about anger anymore. It was about placement, about why I had been positioned so close to something I was never allowed to see. The woman answered without hesitation, "Because you were predictable." And when she saw my expression change, she added, "That is not an insult. It is a classification." I stared at her and said, "My wife used me as a classification?" And she shook her head immediately and replied, "No. She used stability as protection. You were part of the perimeter." I did not understand that sentence at first, and I think she saw that, because she continued, she believed that if her personal life remained stable, no one would suspect the instability of her professional world. I leaned forward slightly and said, "And did it work?" The attorney looked down at the table before answering, "Until last week." A quiet pressure filled the room after that, like the building itself had leaned closer. I asked, "What happened last week?" And the woman hesitated for the first time since I met her, then said, "A data extraction attempt was detected from a secured server linked to her research division." And I felt my pulse slow again, not from calm, but from recognition that something external had touched her life before I even knew it was vulnerable. "And that is what caused the crash," I said. But it was not a question. It was a conclusion forming too quickly, and the attorney immediately replied, "We are not authorized to make that determination yet," which was the closest thing to confirmation I had heard all night. I stood up again and walked toward the window, looking out at Manhattan below, people moving like distant signals of lives that still made sense, and I said, "So my wife dies in a highway accident, and I find out she had a second identity, a second life. And now you are telling me there is classified data involved, and I am supposed to accept that as coincidence?" The woman answered softly, "No. You are supposed to accept that your understanding of coincidence may not apply here." I turned back toward them and said, "Then tell me what I am supposed to do." And for the first time, the attorney looked directly at me and said, "You are supposed to decide whether you are willing to continue standing where she placed you or step into what she kept you from." And as he said that, my phone in my pocket vibrated once, a single sharp pulse, and I had not received a message from anyone connected to Claire since the notification of her death. And I pulled it out slowly because something in me already knew that whatever was on that screen had not come from a memory, but from something still moving in the dark. The vibration in my pocket felt louder than it should have been, not because of the sound itself, but because of the timing, because in that room high above Manhattan, every sentence had started to feel like it was arriving with consequence attached to it. I pulled the phone out slowly, almost unwillingly, and for a moment I only saw the glow of the screen reflecting on my hand before the message resolved into something I did not recognize at first. A single line, no name attached, only a timestamp and coordinates. Then another line beneath it, "Do not trust the attorney." I felt my breath stop halfway in my chest, not from fear, but from recognition that someone else had been listening to everything happening in that room. The woman near the window noticed my expression immediately. "What is it?" she asked, and I hesitated before turning the screen toward her. The attorney stepped closer without being asked, and when he saw it, his face changed in a way I had not seen before. Not surprise, but something closer to concern that had been delayed too long. "That number is not in our system," he said quietly, and I replied, "Then whose system is it in?" And no one answered. A moment later, the door to the penthouse opened again without warning, and the air in the room shifted instantly, like pressure changing before a storm. A man stepped inside, mid-60s, dark coat, posture straight, in a way that suggested habit rather than effort. And I noticed immediately that both the attorney and the woman stopped speaking at the same time. The attorney said his name under his breath, Colonel Hayes. And I looked at him because that name meant nothing to me. Yet the reaction in the room made it feel like it should have. The man closed the door behind him calmly, then looked directly at me, as if I had been expected all along. "Ethan Walker," he said, and I did not respond immediately because the way he said my name carried weight that did not belong to strangers. "Who are you?" I finally asked, and he nodded slightly as if confirming something to himself before answering. "I am someone your wife trusted more than she trusted her own safety." The woman near the window stepped back a half step, and I noticed for the first time she was no longer in control of the room. The attorney spoke carefully. "Sir, this is not an authorized disclosure environment." But the man ignored him completely and kept his eyes on me. "You are not supposed to be involved yet," he said, and I replied, "Involved in what?" And for the first time that night, I felt the conversation shift away from confusion and into something structured, something military in its precision even if no one had said the word. He walked further into the room and stopped near the table, glancing at the documents without touching them. "Your wife was not just a researcher," he said, "and she was not just a patient scientist working under contract." And he paused briefly before adding, "She was part of a continuity protocol that activates only when something goes wrong outside controlled conditions." I looked at him and said, "My wife died in a highway crash," and he answered immediately, "That is one version of the event." The words hit differently than anything before them because they were not denial, they were classification. I felt my hands tighten slightly as I asked, "And what is the other version?" He finally looked away from me toward the city outside, then said that she was extracted. The attorney moved quickly. "Colonel, you are exceeding your authority," but the man raised a hand slightly without looking at him, and the room went quiet again. Then he turned back to me. "Ethan, I need you to understand something," he said, and hearing my name used like that made my stomach tighten because it was no longer formal. It was personal in a way that carried history I had not been told I had. "Your wife was working on systems that do not remain private once they reach a certain threshold," he continued. "And when that threshold was crossed, she activated a contingency that included you whether you were prepared or not." I shook my head slowly and said, "I was never part of any of this." And for the first time his expression softened slightly, not in disagreement, but in acknowledgement of something painful. "That is exactly what she wanted you to believe," he said. The woman finally spoke again, quieter now. "He is not cleared for this level of detail," but the colonel replied without turning to her. "He is already inside the perimeter, whether we like it or not." I stepped back toward the window because the room felt smaller suddenly, and I asked, "So what now? You are all telling me my wife built a second life, died in a crash that may not be what it seems, and left me a penthouse full of secrets. What am I supposed to do with that?" The colonel walked closer until he was only a few feet away, then said, "You are supposed to follow what she left behind before someone else deletes it permanently." I stared at him and said, "Someone else?" And he nodded once. "Yes," he said, "and they already know you are here." For a moment no one moved, no one spoke, and the only sound in the room was the distant city below us continuing as if none of this existed, and then my phone vibrated again in my hand, one single pulse, and when I looked down, the screen had changed, and this time there were no coordinates, only a single sentence that had not been there before. "Leave the building now." And before I could even process what that meant, the lights in the penthouse flickered once, very briefly, like something had just acknowledged our presence from somewhere outside the room. The message on my phone remained on the screen longer than it should have, as if the device itself was waiting for me to decide whether I was going to obey it or ignore it. And for a moment I simply stood there inside the penthouse listening to the faint hum of electricity in the walls while the colonel watched me without speaking. "Leave the building now." The message said again when the screen refreshed, And I felt a strange contradiction rise inside me because nothing about the room suggested immediate danger, and yet everything about the tone suggested certainty. The attorney moved first, stepping toward the door and saying, "We should comply until we verify the source." But the colonel stopped him with a single glance and said, "If we leave now, we lose control of visibility." And I asked quietly, "Visibility into what?" And no one answered me directly. Instead, the colonel looked at me and said, "Into who is already tracking this location." And that was the first time I noticed something subtle, almost imperceptible, like a hesitation in the building's ambient sound. A shift in the quiet that felt less natural. The woman who had been standing near the window finally spoke again, her voice lower than before. "This is no longer just an estate matter." And I turned toward her immediately because that was the first time anyone had admitted there was a boundary between what I was supposed to be seeing and what I was not. The colonel walked toward the center table and placed his hand near the folder without touching it, then said, "Your wife's research intersected with systems that are monitored in real time," and I replied, "You keep saying systems. What systems?" And he looked at me for a long moment before answering. "Pattern mapping infrastructure used for predictive neurological modeling under defense research contracts." And I felt the words pass through me without landing, not because I did not understand them individually, but because I could not connect them to the woman I had buried days ago. I shook my head slightly and said, "Claire was not part of anything like that." And the colonel responded, "That is because she never allowed you to be part of it." And there was no accusation in his tone, only confirmation. I walked slowly toward the center of the room again, trying to anchor myself in something physical, the weight of the carpet, the reflection in the glass, the smell of coffee still lingering. And I said, "If she was involved in something like this, I would have noticed." And the woman replied immediately, "No, you would have adapted." That answer stayed with me longer than anything else she had said. The attorney finally broke his silence and said, "There are multiple operational identities associated with Dr. Walker across 3 jurisdictions." And I turned toward him sharply and asked, "How many identities does one person need?" And he replied, "As many as are required to maintain separation between exposure vectors." I repeated the phrase exposure vectors under my breath because it sounded like something designed to remove humanity from a sentence. And I said, "You are talking about my wife like she was an asset." And the colonel responded quietly, "In some contexts, she was classified as one." I felt a slow pressure building behind my ribs, not anger yet, something closer to disbelief trying to hold its shape. And I asked, "Then what was she to me?" And for a moment no one answered, and that silence felt like the most honest thing anyone had said so far. Then the woman stepped closer and said, "That is the part she never documented." And I asked, "Why not?" And she replied, "Because documentation creates exposure." The colonel moved slightly closer to me now, lowering his voice, and said, "Ethan, your wife was not simply working on research. She was embedded in a continuity program designed to survive institutional collapse." And I frowned and said, "Institutional collapse of what?" And he answered, "Of trust between systems that are not supposed to fail at the same time." I felt the room tilt again, not physically, but conceptually, as if I was being asked to accept that my entire understanding of stability had been incomplete. "In the crash," I said slowly, "where does that fit into this?" The colonel did not answer immediately, and when he finally did, he said, "That is what we are still determining." And I noticed he chose the word determining, not investigating, not concluding. I looked down at my phone again and saw the message had changed once more. Now it simply said, "You are not supposed to arrive in New York." I felt something cold settle in my thoughts because that sentence implied intent, not coincidence. The attorney suddenly spoke with urgency. "We need to relocate immediately. This location is no longer secure." And the woman nodded once, but the colonel did not move. Instead, he looked at me and said, "Before we leave, you need to understand one more thing." And I asked, "What now?" And he replied, "Your wife did not only leave instructions for what happens after her death. She left instructions for what happens if you find out too early." I felt my breathing slow as I said, "And what happens if I did?" And he looked at me directly and said, "Then you become part of the same classification she was trying to protect you from." At that moment, the lights in the penthouse flickered again, longer this time, and somewhere deep in the building a mechanical sound shifted, like a lock engaging that had not been activated in years, and the woman turned toward the door and whispered, They are inside the building now. And I realized that whatever truth I had just begun to touch was no longer waiting to be discovered. It was already moving toward us. The warning came without sound, but the entire penthouse reacted to it as if sound was not necessary anymore, as if the building itself understood what silence meant when danger was close. And I remember the woman stepping away from the door instantly while the colonel moved closer to me instead of away, as if proximity was the only thing that still mattered. "We do not have time for this," the attorney said, his voice tighter now, and for the first time he no longer sounded controlled, only stressed, and that change alone told me more than anything else in the room. The colonel looked at him and said, "You are reacting too late," and I asked, "Late for what?" But nobody answered because the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside the penthouse door had already replaced explanation. Not loud, not rushed, controlled. That kind of movement that suggests certainty, not panic. The attorney took a step back and whispered, "This should not be possible." And the woman replied, "It is already inside the building system." And I felt something shift in my chest because she did not say, "someone." She said, "system." Like this was not an individual threat, but an organized one. The colonel finally turned to me and said, "Ethan, listen carefully. Whatever happens next, do not react emotionally." And I almost laughed because the idea of emotional control in that moment felt like asking a sinking ship to stay level. The footsteps stopped outside the door. 1 second of silence. Then, a soft electronic tone, like access verification. The attorney immediately said, "They are trying to open the floor access remotely." And he moved toward the console near the wall, typing rapidly, but the system did not respond the way he expected. Instead, a light on the panel turned from green to amber, and then to red. And I heard him say under his breath, "That is not our protocol." The colonel stepped forward and placed his hand on the table, steady, and said, "They are overriding jurisdictional access layers." And I asked, "Who are they?" And for the first time he did not hesitate before answering, "People who do not require authorization anymore." The door lock engaged again, this time louder, mechanical, final, and the woman turned toward me and said, "You need to understand something before they enter. Your wife built redundancy into her entire existence. That includes you." I stared at her and said, "Stop speaking in riddles." And she replied, "It is not a riddle, it is structure." Then everything changed at once. The door did not open, it did not break. It simply unlocked as if it had been waiting for the correct permission all along, and the handle turned slowly from the outside. The attorney backed away completely now, saying, "This is a violation of active containment protocol." And the colonel said quietly, "No, this is confirmation of it." The door opened. A man stood there, not aggressive, not armed in any visible way, just calm, too calm, the kind of calm that does not belong in uncertain rooms. He looked at me first, then at the colonel, and finally at the woman, and he said, "We are out of time," as if he was continuing a conversation already in progress long before I arrived. The attorney raised his voice for the first time. "You are trespassing on protected estate jurisdiction," but the man ignored him completely and walked into the room, stopping only when he reached the center table. He looked at the folder with my wife's name again and said, "The secondary subject has been exposed," and I immediately said, "I am not a subject," and the man finally turned toward me directly. "You are now," he replied. The room went still in a way that felt heavier than silence, and I felt something inside me harden, not into anger, but into clarity. The colonel stepped between us slightly and said, "You are escalating classification beyond authorized disclosure." And the man responded, "Authorized disclosure ended when the crash report was altered." The attorney froze and said, "What crash report?" And the man looked at him and replied, "The one you were not supposed to access." I felt my pulse slow as I asked, "Are you saying my wife's death was changed on paper?" And the man answered, "I'm saying it was stabilized into a narrative." The woman finally spoke again, her voice lower now, almost exhausted. "They are not here for negotiation." And the attorney looked at me and said, "You need to understand, this situation is no longer legal. It is operational." I turned back toward the man in the doorway and said something I did not expect myself to say, calm, steady, almost detached. "Then tell me the truth without classification." And for the first time his expression changed slightly, like he had been waiting for that exact sentence. He stepped forward and said, "Your wife did not die in an uncontrolled accident. She transitioned out of a compromised environment using a pre-established exit protocol, and I asked, "And what does that mean for me?" And he answered without hesitation, "It means she assumed you would eventually find your way here." The attorney shook his head and said, "This is not possible. She did not have authority to activate that level of protocol." But the man replied, "She did once she became aware of internal breach conditions." I looked around the room slowly, at all of them, realizing for the first time that nobody was surprised anymore, only positioned. Then I asked the question that felt like it had been waiting inside me since the first moment I stepped into the penthouse. "So where is she now?" And the man looked at me directly and said, "That depends on whether you are ready to follow what she left behind or continue believing she is gone." And before I could respond, my phone vibrated one last time, and the screen lit up with a new message that simply said, "If you are reading this, you are already inside." And in that instant, I understood that whatever truth I was standing in was no longer something I had walked into. It was something I had been led into from the very beginning. The message on my phone stayed lit longer than it should have, as if the screen itself did not want to disappear. And I remember standing in the center of the penthouse watching the man in the doorway, watching the colonel beside me, watching the attorney who now looked like he had lost the ability to decide which rules still applied. The room felt like it had stopped belonging to any of us, only to something larger that had already begun before we arrived. The man at the door finally stepped inside fully, closing it behind him with a controlled motion, and he said, "We are past containment now," as if he was reporting weather conditions rather than describing collapse. The attorney immediately responded, "You cannot override a federal estate activation protocol." And the man looked at him with something close to disappointment and said, "It was never just an estate." The colonel did not speak this time, and I noticed that silence from him carried more weight than anything he had said before. I asked quietly, "Then what is it?" And no one answered right away. Because somewhere beneath us in the building I heard faint movement again, multiple levels below, not rushing, not chaotic, but coordinated. The woman finally spoke, almost to herself. "They are inside the network layer." And the attorney turned sharply toward her and said, "You told me the perimeter was stable, and that." Instantly, it was stable until the secondary subject was confirmed alive in the system. I felt a cold clarity form in my thoughts at the word alive, because no one had said that about my wife in days. Not since the crash report. Not since the funeral. I took a step forward and said, "Stop speaking around me. Say it directly. What is my status in this?" And the man at the door finally looked at me without hesitation and said, "You are a confirmation node." The attorney immediately shook his head and said, "That designation was never authorized for activation." And for the first time, the man raised his voice slightly, not in anger, but in certainty, and said, "Authorization changed when internal breach signals were detected in Boston." The colonel finally spoke again, quietly, "You are referring to the leak window." And the man nodded once. That was when I realized they were no longer debating reality. They were referencing it like documentation. The attorney suddenly turned toward the colonel and said, "You knew about this longer than you disclosed." And the colonel replied calmly, "I knew about the framework, not the collapse." And the attorney snapped back, "That is not how oversight works." And the colonel said, "It is when the system is compartmentalized above your clearance." I stood there listening to them argue about my life like it was a file being reclassified in real time, and I said, "All of you stop." And the room actually did. Not because I had authority, but because I had become the only variable not assigned a category yet. I looked at the colonel and said, "Tell me what she is," and he hesitated before answering. She was part of a continuity layer designed to preserve data integrity across institutional failure scenarios, and I asked, "And what does that make me?" And he replied, "You are the continuity anchor." The attorney suddenly laughed once, sharp and disbelieving, and said, "This is insane. You are treating a civilian spouse as operational infrastructure." And the man at the door turned toward him and said, "She agreed to it," and the attorney snapped back immediately. "No, she did not. She signed an estate trust, not a containment protocol." And for the first time, the man's expression changed slightly because he said, "You are mixing documents with intent." That sentence landed differently, because it was the first time I heard someone suggest that everything I was looking at had two meanings at once. Then something happened that changed the temperature of the room. The attorney received a call. He looked at the screen, froze, and said nothing for a full 3 seconds before answering. I watched his face change as he listened. First confusion, then disbelief, then something closer to panic that he tried to suppress. "That is not possible," he said into the phone, and then, "You are sure?" The colonel stepped closer and said, "What is it?" But the attorney did not answer him. He ended the call and looked at all of us, and for the first time his voice was no longer controlled. "The Boston server cluster just rejected all internal authentication keys," he said, and the woman immediately said, "That means she triggered external exposure," and the attorney replied, "That is not supposed to happen without executive authorization," and the man at the door said quietly, "Which is why it is happening without it." I felt the structure of the room begin to shift again, not physically, but socially, because suddenly they were no longer aligned. The attorney turned on the colonel and said, "You knew the system was unstable," and the colonel replied, "I told you it was compartmentalized," and the attorney snapped, "That is not the same thing as warning us." And the colonel said, "It was the only thing I was allowed to say." The woman suddenly stepped back and said, "We are losing internal coherence," and the man at the door replied, "We already lost it when the subject was declared deceased incorrectly." And I asked, "Stop. Who declared her dead incorrectly?" And he looked at me and said, "The same system that is now correcting itself through you." That was the moment they started breaking apart from each other. The attorney pointed at the colonel and said, "You used me to validate documentation you knew was unstable." And the colonel replied, "You validated it because you needed it to be true." And the woman turned on both of them and said, "You are both reacting too late. The extraction window is closing." And the attorney said, "There is no extraction window." And the man at the door said, "There is now." I stood in the center of all of it and realized something that made everything quieter inside me than it had been all night. None of them were protecting the same truth. They were protecting their version of it, and each version was now collapsing under the weight of the others. I asked one final question, calmly, almost detached. "Where does my wife fit in all of this now?" And for the first time, no one rushed to answer. The attorney looked away. The colonel lowered his eyes. The woman stared at the floor. Only the man at the door spoke, and he said, "She does not fit anymore." She initiated the separation event, and in that silence that followed, I understood something no one had said yet. I was no longer trying to find out what happened to my wife. I was standing inside the moment where every version of what happened was beginning to fail at the same time. The moment the system began collapsing around us, it did not feel like chaos the way movies describe it. It felt quieter than that, more deliberate, as if every decision had already been made somewhere else and we were only now being allowed to witness the consequences arrive. The attorney stood frozen near the center table, staring at his phone as new alerts kept appearing one after another, and I could see his certainty dissolving in real time. The colonel was no longer giving instructions. The woman had stopped speaking entirely, and the man at the door simply watched everything with the patience of someone who had seen this outcome before. I finally said, "No more systems, no more classifications. Just tell me what is happening." And for the first time, no one tried to translate the truth into something I could not understand. The attorney swallowed hard and said, "The Boston node has fully detached from internal oversight." And I asked, "What does that mean in normal language?" And he replied, "It means we no longer control the narrative of your wife's status." That sentence did something to the room. Not panic, not relief, just a shift, like a weight being lifted that no one had expected to be carrying for so long. The colonel finally spoke in a lower voice. "It means she is no longer classified as contained or deceased within their framework." And I looked at him and said, "So she is alive?" And he hesitated before answering. "It means the system can no longer agree on what she is." That answer should have frustrated me, but instead it made something in my chest go still, because for the first time the uncertainty felt honest. The man at the door stepped forward and said, "This is the stabilization phase." And I asked him, "Stabilization of what?" And he replied, "Of her exit protocol completing without interference." I looked around the room slowly and realized something that surprised me more than anything else that night. Nobody was arguing anymore. The attorney was no longer blaming the colonel. The colonel was no longer correcting the attorney. The woman was no longer warning us. They had all stopped trying to control the outcome because the outcome had already passed beyond them. I asked quietly, "Where does that leave me?" And the man answered, "Outside of it, that should have felt like exclusion, but instead it felt like release." I walked toward the window again, looking out at Manhattan, at the steady movement of lights and distance, And for a moment, I thought about Claire not as a mystery or a system or a classified identity, but as a person who once sat across from me at a kitchen table and said she was tired in a voice I had not fully understood. I said, almost to myself, I do not want any more of this, and the colonel responded softly, then you are already free of it. And I turned back toward him and said, free of what exactly? And he replied, of being required to participate. The attorney finally spoke again, quieter now, almost exhausted. There will be inquiries. There will be formal reviews. Nothing about this will be clean. And I nodded, because that part finally made sense in a way everything else had not. The man at the door added, but none of that requires your involvement anymore. And I asked, then why was I brought here? And he looked at me directly and said, because she needed you to stop searching for her inside systems that were never designed to hold her truth. That sentence stayed in the room longer than anything else. The woman finally walked toward me and said, there is something else you should understand. And I asked, what now? And she replied, your wife did not design this to make you follow her. She designed it so you could leave it. I felt my throat tighten slightly, not from sadness, but from recognition of something I had been resisting since the beginning. All of this tension, all of this movement, all of this confusion had not been pulling me deeper into a mission. It had been pushing me out of one. The colonel placed a folder gently on the table and said, your legal connection to all operational classifications has been dissolved. And I looked at the folder and said, what about her? And he answered, her status remains unresolved, but no longer actionable. The words should have hurt more than they did, but instead they felt like distance finally being created where there had only been collision. I took a step back and said, so what do I do now? And no one rushed to answer, because for the first time that night there was no system left that required my participation. The man at the door finally spoke again, and his voice was different now, less procedural, more human, and he said, you go home. I looked at him and asked, and then what? And he replied, then you live in what remains, not in what was hidden. I stood there for a long moment, letting the weight of that settle without resisting it, and I realized something unexpected. I was no longer trying to solve my wife's disappearance. I was no longer trying to decode her life. I was simply tired of standing inside a structure that never truly belonged to grief, only to interpretation. I turned toward the window one last time, and I said quietly, I think I am done. And no one argued with me. Not because they agreed, but because for the first time, agreement was no longer required. And as I walked toward the door that I had entered as a witness and was now leaving as something else entirely, I understood that the most important truth I would carry out of that building was not about what my wife had been, but about what I no longer needed to be. The elevator doors closed behind me with a soft, final sound that felt nothing like an ending and more like the world simply deciding I was no longer inside that version of it. And as the penthouse disappeared floor by floor above me, I stood in silence with my reflection in the mirrored metal, noticing something I had not seen before in the last several hours. My face looked unchanged, but something behind it was no longer carrying the same weight. When I stepped out into the night air of Manhattan, the city did not feel different, but I did. The attorney had said nothing more. The colonel had only nodded once. The woman had handed me a small sealed envelope before I left, and the man at the door had said, do not look for answers in systems anymore. Look for what remains when systems fail. I did not understand it then, but I think I understand it now. I walked for a long time that night, not because I was lost, but because I needed to feel what life was like without being pulled by something I could not see. Eventually, I found myself sitting on a bench near the Hudson River, the water moving slowly under the city lights, steady and indifferent. And I realized I had not checked my phone in over an hour, which for the first time felt like a choice instead of a reflex. The envelope in my hand was simple, unmarked, and inside it there was only a single key and a handwritten note in Claire's handwriting, steady and precise, as if she had written it knowing I would need it to be simple enough to survive reading it. It said, if you are holding this, then I did not disappear the way you were told. I only stepped out of what could not hold both of us. I read it twice without moving, letting the words settle without trying to force meaning from them too quickly. For the first time, I did not feel like I was chasing her anymore. I felt like I was being asked to stop. In the days that followed, nothing dramatic happened. No more doors opened, no more systems activated. No more people appeared to explain what reality was supposed to be. Instead, something quieter happened. The attorney sent a formal notice of full estate dissolution and legal separation of all classified obligations tied to my name. The colonel did not contact me again. The woman's number no longer connected. And the man at the door, whoever he truly was, left only a final message that said, "She completed what she intended. Do not interfere with what is no longer unstable." I went back to Arlington 2 days later. The house felt different, not because it had changed, but because I had. I stood in the kitchen where Claire and I had shared so many ordinary mornings, and I realized something simple that I had never understood before. Love does not always end in loss. Sometimes it ends in separation of understanding. I found myself sitting at the table for a long time, not looking for signs, not replaying memories, just sitting in the presence of what remained. A life that had been real, even if it had not been fully shared. And in that quiet, I understood what the colonel meant when he said I was no longer required to participate. I was no longer inside a story that needed to be solved. I was inside a life that needed to be lived. Claire's absence did not feel like an unanswered question anymore. It felt like a boundary that had finally been respected. I think the hardest truth I had to accept was not that she had hidden part of her life, but that I had assumed love meant total access to another person's existence. And I was wrong about that. Not because trust does not matter, but because autonomy matters just as much. Weeks passed, then months. Slowly, life stopped feeling like a search and started feeling like a return. I began reconnecting with people I had not spoken to in years, not out of obligation, but out of simplicity. I learned how to sit in silence without waiting for it to break into answers. I learned how to eat dinner without turning every thought into analysis. I even learned how to walk without expecting the next message to change the direction of my day. One evening, I visited the river again, the same place I had sat that first night, and I brought the key with me. I did not use it. I simply held it for a while, then placed it on the bench beside me. It was not a symbol of loss anymore. It was a reminder that some doors are not meant to be reopened, only understood. I think about Claire sometimes now, not as someone I lost, but as someone who lived further than I was able to follow. And I think she would have wanted it that way, not as distance, but as dignity. To anyone listening who has ever felt like they are standing outside a truth they cannot enter, I want to say this without telling you what to do. You are allowed to step back. You are allowed to choose peace over pursuit. You are allowed to stop holding on to questions that are only keeping you inside pain. Sometimes love is not about holding on tighter. Sometimes it is about recognizing when life is asking you to hold yourself instead. And if there is anything I have learned through all of this, it is that identity is not defined by what is hidden from us, but by what we choose to carry forward when the hiding ends. If this story has stayed with you, if it has found something in your own life that feels familiar in a quiet way, then I am grateful you are here. You are not alone in trying to understand things that do not fully explain themselves. And maybe none of us are meant to understand everything. Maybe we are only meant to continue forward with what remains honest. If you feel moved by this story, you can like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below, not as a reaction, but as a reflection of your own experience, because sometimes being heard matters more than being answered. The lesson I carry from all of this is simple. Self-awareness is not about uncovering every truth, but about knowing when truth has already asked you to let go. There are more stories ahead, stories of loss, of understanding, of unexpected clarity, and of people learning how to return to themselves after everything familiar changes shape. And if you choose to continue with those stories, I will be here to share them with you. Thank you for listening to this story.